Hey guys, welcome to our first Ed Puzzle for 2021. I got a haircut. That's basically all I did during Christmas vacation. Hope you guys had a good break. We're going to get into the last section of our Gilded Age chapter, which is the rise and really the fall of organized labor. We talked all about big business and the more unscrupulous means of some of the robber barons like Carnegie, Rockefeller, what they did to achieve their wealth, and really at the expense of not only consumers, but also workers, all with government help. So really all of this piles together. And really the first official labor union that we see, they began as far back as the 1630s in places like Maine, but really the first official one was the Federal Society of Journeymen Cordwainers of Philadelphia, and cordwainer is a rope maker. And they were organized in 1794, and they embodied, much like every labor union that we're going to talk about going forward, all the way up until the 60s, 1960s and 1970s, really the same goals. They want more money, they want better working conditions, better benefits, shorter hours, all of those things that today we take for granted and just assume as part of our jobs, but that we know did not exist really until the 1900s. And as a result of the Second Industrial Revolution, we start to see the working man come together much more because across the board, they're being exploited in basically every single industry. And the first labor union of this time was called the National Labor Union. And they attempted to get all types of different workers into one organization. And we're going to see that's really a problem because we're going to talk about skilled versus unskilled labor. And you also have different laborers that require different things as part of their job. So really one giant labor union doesn't necessarily work in that regard. But they demanded the idea of an 8-hour day and wanted the rights of women furthered and included in the workplace. It wasn't very successful. The two that we're going to talk about that are successful, the first one is the Knights of Labor. And immediately by their name, they start to have this kind of militant idea. And they're created secretly by a guy named Uriah Stevens, but they really take a public turn under this guy who has just a phenomenal mustache that I will be eventually going for, a guy named Terrence V. Powderly. And with their more militant name, they really became known as a much more radical group because they favored socialism and take a lot of their tendencies from some of the communist ideology that will be coming over from Eastern Europe. They wanted equality for women and African Americans, and they also wanted both skilled and unskilled laborers in the same union. Obviously, skilled labor requires a little bit more apprenticeship, a little bit more learning, but they wanted to incorporate all workers into their same union. By 1886, they had nearly 1 million members, and they were hoping to take a more political route for success and equality in the workplace. And they believed that a socialist party would be the agenda to achieve that. And as we're going to see, they're really going to fail pretty quickly. The other one that's far more successful and actually still exists today is the American Federation of Labor, founded in 1886. It was created by this guy on the screen right here. His name was Samuel Gompers. Much more conservative movement, not only in their ideology, but also in their goals. They were not interested in politics as a way to solve problems. They instead believed that we should work on short-term goals using what's called collective bargaining. And Gompers famously said, laws are not the answers to economic problems. Collective bargaining is. Let labor and management come to the table, work out a contract, and the union bargains as one collective entity. And in this case, their union would only represent skilled laborers. And they still do exist today as the AFL-CIO, which we'll talk about. They're the giant organization. And all of these labor unions, no matter what they were at the time, whether they wanted skilled laborers or unskilled laborers, wanted all the same things. In particular, I mentioned several. They also wanted to add in restrictions on immigration because they don't want cheap labor taking their jobs. They wanted an end to child labor, which was also seen as a way to provide cheap labor. And then lastly, they wanted the right to organize, to strike, and to collectively bargain. Right. So organize, coming together. Striking is a weapon of the worker to get back at management for any violations of basic work laws. and collectively bargaining. As a group, we are going to organize ourselves. We're going to try to achieve one goal and come to the table with those demands in mind. However, as you can imagine, the robber barons are not going to sit back and take this lightly. And they have their own weapons really to undermine the rise of organized labor. The first one is called the Yellow Dog Contract, which a worker would be forced to sign when taking a job that would guarantee they would not join a union. And if they did, they'd be immediately fired. Blacklisting was also a weapon. Employers would publish the names in the newspapers and blackball workers who had joined unions or had publicly favored unions. And of course, because government is run by the trusts, right? We looked at that cartoon with the Senate run by the trusts. The government will step in and always side with management. And in several cases, like the Homestead Steel Strike, for example, and the Great Pullman Strike, strikers would be broken up by troops, claiming to protect the 5th and 14th Amendment rights of corporations, because remember, they were seen as people. And judges would force striking workers back to work, saying that they were violating restrictions on trade, which is part of the Commerce Clause of the first article of the Constitution. Culturally, labor unions were really looked down upon as well because they were seen as a European idea. They promoted the ideas of socialism, communism, and as we're going to see, are associated with anarchy and violence. And also another great weapon of the robber barons were scabs and immigrants. They would hire these people to replace striking workers for much, much lower wages. And they could be used, as Jay Gould says here, really as a weapon of class warfare. You could use them against each other. He said, I could hire one half of the working class to kill the other half, just by getting them at odds with each other instead of the real enemy here, which was the owners of big business. So we really don't see labor unions take off with any real promise during this time because there's so many negative things that come along with labor unions at the time, most of them violence associated with anarchy. President Grant famously said, labor disgraces no man, but some men disgrace labor. And he's referring to those that strike and don't just buy into the will set forth from robber barons. So there are a couple of strikes that we're going to go over. The first one, really the first national strike, was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And railroad workers had suffered severe wage cuts from the Vanderbilt industry, and they struck violently in major cities. And you can even see here, just from this headline, right? Pittsburgh sacked, the city in the power of a howling mob, and Chicago in the possession of communism. So even the media is portraying them as these violent anarchists, when in actuality, they were just really fighting for themselves and their basic economic rights. Federal troops were sent in to break up these strikes, but all of a sudden they start to kind of gain a little bit of traction nationally and be successful. We're going to see that Chicago is going to be the home of a lot of labor strikes. In particular, the next one, which is in the podcast, you're going to listen to the Haymarket Square Riot, which I'm going to skip for now because the podcast does a lot of it. But this is really the end of the Knights of Labor. You can see in this painting here, you see a bomb that was set off in Chicago that killed several police officers, and as a result, really made people think negatively about the entire labor union and the movement because they were associated with anarchy. The Homestead Steel Strike of 1892, the third deadliest labor dispute in American history. This is the one that really made Andrew Carnegie look terrible because his right-hand man, Henry Clay Frick, sent in the Pinkertons to put down a strike, killed 10 people. They had to call in the Pennsylvania National Guard to take over the plant, and it just made Carnegie look terrible. The last one, which we'll read an article on, was the Pullman Strike of 1894, where workers were living things very similar to the Carnegie work towns called Pullman towns, and they struck back against wages. And in this case, they employed a guy named Eugene V. Debs, who we'll talk a lot more about in our next chapter in particular. But he was a socialist who he won 1 million votes in jail when he ran for president in 1920. But he was basically called in to organize this railway union strike. Really, really successful. But The federal government sends in troops. They killed 30 strikers, wounded another 60. And Debs is actually arrested for organizing this entire thing as an act of treason. Really, as a result, to appease all of this, you can almost argue it's a win for labor. President Cleveland and Congress passed a resolution declaring Labor Day a national holiday, recognizing the American worker. So that's why we have that holiday. And it was really created in response to all of the violence that was going on to appease laborers. Now, we're going to see that really after this point, labor unions are not very successful, and they won't really rise up again until the New Deal, when with the Wagner Act of 1935, Congress makes it a federal law that recognizes labor unions' rights to organize, strike, and collectively bargain. Last thing that we're going to talk about for labor is the role of women in the workplace. Of course, underrepresented groups are so important with AP. And women, we're going to start to see that during this time period, really start to begin working outside the home much more than they had previously been, and certainly will continue into the 1900s. Of course, for this time period, women were paid much less, than men, but were also expected all the while to do the role of the homemaker. So there's really a balancing act for women. We're going to see new jobs emerge like cashiers, salespersons, secretaries, nurses, particularly with the rise of urban hospitals as a result of the growth of cities. But again, always being paid less. And we still see them working in pretty terrible conditions in factories and textile mills until when we get to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in our next chapter.